Welcome to the very first deep dive. My name's Steve. I'm a practicing physical therapist with a background in exercise science and nutrition. And today we're kicking it off with a deep dive series into intermittent fasting. So this will be a thorough literature review with the goal of separating the scientific evidence from the hype when it comes to intermittent fasting and fasting in general, as there are a lot of bold claims floating around with different videos and going around on the internet with regard to intermittent fasting. Some of them do have some scientific merit, but many of them have no evidence to support them whatsoever. So we want to kind of pick those apart, see which ones are evidence-based, and hopefully through doing that, you'll learn some strategies to make your own program more effective. This will be split up into a video series. It's a big topic, and I'd like to do it justice, so I don't want to wind up with a 2-hour video. But through the series, we'll discuss the impact of intermittent fasting on weight loss, how it affects muscle, your cardiovascular health, how it affects your hormones, metabolic health, gut health, immune function. We'll go over some of the best strategies to get the most benefit given different lifestyles and goals. And toward the end, we'll wrap it up with some tips to minimize hunger, boost fat burning, maximize energy, and increase your mental focus. Getting into a fasting state and starting intermittent fasting, if you take a scientific, deliberate approach, it really can be done quite painlessly. I've been experimenting with it myself quite a bit lately, and so I'll share some of my own experience and some tips to really make it as easy as possible. So intermittent fasting, I was pleased to find, was very well studied. In my literature review, there are a lot of studies out there, many published just within the last year, this year, 2023. But most of them are small studies. So because the studies have a relatively small sample size, we'll be leaning largely on systematic reviews and meta-analyses. What I don't want to do is find a couple of studies that confirm my personal bias, just kind of cherry pick those results and feed them back to you. So a better approach would be to take systematic reviews where we have the results of many studies in aggregate, put those results together and see what is the average effect on intermittent fasting and get really a better idea of the true effect and reduce the likelihood that we're looking more at statistical outliers. One thing to keep in mind, so I'm only interested here in human studies. I'm not interested in speculating on the biological mechanisms behind how intermittent fasting works and where exactly some of the effects come from. Really what I want to know is what are the effects on humans and how can we take advantage of those effects to benefit ourselves. So most studies on intermittent fasting that we'll be going over were performed on adults ages 40 to 60. When it's different, I'll specify. There will be a couple of individual randomized controlled trials that we'll have to dive into in order to get a complete picture. But for the most part, it's adults aged 40 to 60, in many cases overweight or obese. So what is fasting? All right, simply put, fasting is an abstinence from food or calorie-containing beverages. Functional definition for our purposes, an absence of calories. All right, intermittent fasting, to distinguish, is going to be a routine period of fasting lasting 24 hours or less. Okay, so this is different from a prolonged fast, where you're looking at 48, 72 hours, 7 days, 21 days. That's going to have a little bit different effects as the time goes on compared to an intermittent fast. So we're specifically zoning in on the effects of fasting lasting 24 hours or less. Here's a nice table. This is taken from a study that we'll be going over today. The paper is called the Cardiometabolic Benefits of Intermittent Fasting. A nice review article by Varady and colleagues. So starting at the top, we see a good outline of alternate day fasting. It's exactly what it sounds like. So one day is a fasting day, followed by a feast day. All right, so on the fasting day, you would consume either 0 calories if you're doing a strict fast. Some of the studies did allow the participants to consume a small meal consisting of 25% of their maintenance calorie level. So what that would be, so for example, maintenance calorie level is the number of calories you need to maintain your body weight. So if someone needed 2,000 calories to maintain their body weight, some of the studies allow them to have one small meal of 500 calories during that day and still count it as part of their fasting day. In the middle here, we have the 5-2 diet. Also fairly well studied and is covered in this review. It consists of 2 non-consecutive fasting days per week and 5 feast days or days of unrestricted eating per week. And finally, at the bottom, we have an example of time-restricted eating. This is showing an example of what we would call the 8-16 schedule, which allows an 8-hour eating window and a 16-hour fasting window performed daily. It is 7 days a week, the same every day. There's a few variations on this. 8-16 is probably the most popular from what I've seen, but you could also modify that to expand the eating window a little bit. For example, a 10-14 schedule, similar idea, but you get a 10-hour eating window. Or if you want to kind of constrict the eating window a little bit and get a longer fasting window, you can do what is called a 6-18 schedule, where your eating window is only 6 hours, but then you get 18 hours of fasting day after day. Now, in considering, so today we'll be focusing on the effects of intermittent fasting for weight loss. So is it specifically effective for weight loss? And a few questions that we want to answer in reviewing these articles. All right, does it create a caloric deficit? Okay, caloric deficit in all cases is a prerequisite for weight loss. So somehow or another, all weight loss strategies that are effective do have one commonality, and that is some way or another they result in a caloric deficit. All right, so if your body burns this number of calories, you're consuming more than that day after day, what will happen? Your body weight will increase. So you'll take in that extra energy, whatever you don't use, your body will store as adipose tissue in your fat cells. Now, what happens if you significantly decrease? So your body needs this number of calories, you're only getting this much. Well, your body is not taking in enough calories to maintain all of the tissue that you have, and so it's going to have to supplement with energy stored in your fat cells. Right? So some of that fat will be burned as energy. You'll lose it. The body weight will come down. So whether that's done from a diet approach of reducing your caloric intake, or on the other side, you can increase the number of calories your body burns by exercising more or increasing physical activity. Somehow, to lose weight, we do need to create a caloric deficit. We also want to consider how much of the weight is specifically coming from fat with regard to intermittent fasting. So we're not looking to lose water weight. We don't want to just burn off some glycogen and gain it back the next day just from using carbohydrates stored in the muscle. And we certainly don't want to lose muscle or bone mass. So we do want to consider how much of the weight specifically is coming from fat, and is that any better than a regular diet? We also want to consider, is it practical? Is it something that we can stick to? in order to answer this, what we can do is look into some of the adherence rates in the studies and see how many people were really able to follow through and complete the intervention. And of course, intermittent fasting needs to be safe. Otherwise, there's really no point in doing it. All right, so first review, we're going to jump into to answer a couple of these questions. It's done by Varady and colleagues. It's called The Cardiometabolic Benefits of Intermittent Fasting, published in the Annual Review of Nutrition in 2021. So this is a review article that examined 33 trials, some of which were systematic reviews, but not all. It is a great article, and we're going to come back to it when we talk about intermittent fasting related to cardiac health. What they found was that there is an average reduction in caloric intake by 10 to 35%. So it does effectively and significantly result in a decrease in caloric intake without the need to count calories, which is fantastic, because one of the main complaints that people have when they're on a traditional calorie restriction diet is that it's very tedious. They get tired of looking at food labels, trying to write everything down, track it, and adding up their calories each day. This really simplifies it and kind of eliminates that need. You're only tracking your time and whether or not you're in a fasting period or you're not in a fasting period. It's it's pretty simple and straightforward. Now, when it comes to alternate day fasting, one question that a lot of people have is, well, if I'm fasting one day, won't I just eat twice as much the next day and make up for it, essentially? And so the answer is no. They did look at this, and what they found was that on average, individuals doing alternate day fasting only consumed 10 to 15% more calories than normal. So they're still they eat a little more, but they're still in a significant caloric deficit, which will contribute to weight loss. Right? So they were down 75 to 100% calories one day, depending on whether they got that small meal or not on the fasting day. And they're only making up for it by increasing their intake by 10 to 15%. What they also found that for both the alternate day fasting and the 5-2 schedule, I mentioned that some of them were allowed to have a small meal, so 25% of their maintenance calories. They found that those eating a small meal showed no difference in weight loss at least over a short-term period. So if you're looking at the 5-2 diet or the alternate day fasting, you're not sure if you can go 24 hours straight, go an entire day with zero food. At least in terms of weight loss, really you may not need to. It can still be effective having one small meal, which is no more than 25% of your calorie needs. I'd like to transition over to a systematic review by Welton and colleagues called Intermittent Fasting and Weight Loss, published in Canadian Family Physician in 2020. This is a systematic review of 27 trials, 18 of which were randomized control trials. So this is a nice snapshot of some of the results. I did put this table together myself based on the results. There's a great table in the article that breaks down the results in a similar manner between individuals with type 2 diabetes and those without type 2 diabetes. If you're interested in seeing that, go ahead and check out their paper. I have the link in the description. So what they found is that with intermittent fasting, there was a reduction in body weight between 4.6 to 13%. That is a rate of up to 1.1% body weight lost per week. Now, that is a similar rate that can be achieved with a traditional calorie restriction diet. And in terms of the rate of weight loss, there was one study investigating alternate day fasting that found that there was a plateau in the rate of weight loss at 12 weeks. All right, so these studies are investigating intermittent fasting alone, not in conjunction with any other strategies. So if you're about 12 weeks into intermittent fasting, finding that your results in terms of weight loss are starting to plateau, if that's your goal, then that may be a good time to start incorporating other strategies in with the intermittent fasting, maybe increasing exercise or combining intermittent fasting with another dietary strategy. There was one study actually looked at intermittent fasting plus caloric restriction versus intermittent fasting alone, and of course found that the intermittent fasting with calorie restriction was more effective than intermittent fasting in isolation. So in terms of waist circumference, there was a reduction between 3 to 8 centimeters. That was in a 4-week time span. A decrease in body mass index by 4.3%. Body mass index is basically your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. So your weight per your height. And it's just a gross indicator on whether or not you're likely to be underweight at a healthy weight, overweight, or obese. It generalizes pretty well to the overall population, although there are some exceptions. It's used a lot because it's quick and easy to calculate, but it is not a direct measure of body composition. So in terms of metabolic health, they found that there was a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, which is an indicator of blood glucose control over time, reduction in insulin, and reduction in fasting glucose for those with type 2 diabetes. What I did find interesting is that in those without type 2 diabetes, so in people who already had a healthy and stable fasting glucose level, was that fasting glucose was unchanged. So the addition of intermittent fasting did not cause them to develop hypoglycemia, or in other words, have their blood sugar go excessively low, which can cause some problems in terms of safety and also create difficulties in controlling hunger levels and energy levels. In terms of where the weight loss is coming from. All right, so this is in the Welton paper, but the original study was done in Harvey and colleagues, by Harvey and colleagues in 2011. They found that up to 79% of weight loss with intermittent fasting comes from fat specifically. In their study, I did go and read their study just to get an idea of how it was done and who it was done on to see how well we can generalize those results. So they used dual X-ray absorptiometry to determine the changes in body composition with intermittent fasting in 107 premenopausal women aged 30 to 45 years. This may not perfectly generalize to males, and we may find some differences in different age groups as well, but we can at least say in premenopausal women aged 30 to 45 that 75% of the weight loss from intermittent fasting does indeed come from fat. Adherence rates. How easy is intermittent fasting to stick to? If we look at the overall adherence rates, what we find is a range between 77 and 98%. Now, this is looking at the number of people, or percentage of people rather, who are able to complete the intervention that they were assigned to in the study. So 77% is not great. It's similar to that of a traditional calorie restriction diet, although we do see ranges up to 98%, which is quite good. And of course, there are some other strategies that we can incorporate with intermittent fasting to make it easier for us to stick to compared to people who are randomized to it in a study. So they also found that in 3 of 4 studies that hunger levels with intermittent fasting remain stable or decrease. So this is not in comparison to calorie restriction. This is in comparison to unrestricted eating. Right? So intermittent fasting showed lower hunger levels compared to the group that was allowed to eat with no restrictions whatsoever. All right, so in terms of hunger levels, it may be a lot easier to stick with intermittent fasting compared to a traditional diet if hunger is one of your concerns or something that you've struggled with before. All right, so takeaways. What can we take away from this information? So we know that intermittent fasting is at least as effective as a traditional calorie restriction diet for weight loss, which being as effective as a calorie restriction diet for weight loss is not a bad thing. There is a ton of evidence that supports calorie restriction for weight loss, and it does work. It does work extremely well if you actually do it and can stick to it over time, which that's what people really struggle with. The calorie restriction diets typically result in higher hunger levels, and they're tedious to follow. Whereas with intermittent fasting, maybe there's an advantage here of simplicity, which you don't have to track everything that you're eating. You only have to track whether or not you're in a fasting period or you're not in a fasting period, right? So it's either or. It's very simple. But through that strategy, it can result in reduction in calories by 10 to 35%, and that's without the need to count the calories. So intermittent fasting is at least somewhat easy to stick to. There is a wide range of adherence in the literature, but it's something that's doable. It's no more difficult than a traditional diet. Now, we do know that the weight loss is primarily coming from fat, up to 79%. There may be some variation depending on biological sex or age group. And for those following a 5-2 or alternate day fasting strategy, eating that small meal on fasting days did not interfere with weight loss. So at least in terms of weight loss itself, if you're not sure that you can go 24 hours straight without eating and you're looking at trying out either the 5-2 or alternate day fast, you can still have up to 25% of your maintenance calorie intake as one meal and still have effective weight loss. So blood glucose levels remain stable in both healthy people and people with type 2 diabetes. Now, that's a requirement to maintain energy levels, control hunger, and ensure safety. No serious health concerns were reported even in individuals with type 2 diabetes. Now, if you have diabetes and you're considering intermittent fasting as a strategy, I would encourage you to still keep your doctor in the loop, even though it may be a good strategy for you. One of the reasons I'm saying this is because later on, we'll look at a randomized controlled trial done specifically in individuals with type 2 diabetes, and many of them required some medication adjustments. All right, so we want to be safe and be effective. So keep your healthcare team in the loop. Intermittent fasting works well for many people, but it's not the best strategy for everyone. So coming up next video in part 2, we'll dig into which intermittent fasting protocol is best. So we're going to pit time-restricted feeding versus the 5-2 diet versus alternate day fasting. So drop questions in the comments below. We'll do a quick Q&A at the start of the next video. Subscribe. Please like the video and have a great night.